Welcome to Ruins and Haunting Heritage. My name is Dr. April Bisa. I'm an associate professor of anthropology at Vassar College, and this is my archaeology seminar for the fall 2020 semester. Today's lecture is going to be about the hauntings of Indian boarding schools and the archaeology being done at one specific Indian boarding school, the Mount Pleasant School in Michigan. And archaeologists are working on Indian boarding schools throughout the United States and through Canada. And this is an important part of our history in both countries that most people don't learn about. It is a very shameful past, but it is a past that has caused generations of trauma in Indigenous people in both countries. And therefore, the fact that it is hidden, it requires some digging, either physically or through archives or through oral histories, in any way to get it exposed. And the haunting is mostly in that only some people know about it, even though it's affected hundreds and thousands of people and their generations that have come after them. So why is it hidden? And that's part of why the ghosts of this legacy linger. So we're going to go through a journal article by Sarah Surface Evans and Sarah Jones that was published just this year, and the first part of a Indigenous-made horror film, Older Than America, made by Georgina Lightning, to kind of parallel show how archaeology looks at something and how film is another way of looking at something, but how these ghosts are manifest in this Indigenous horror movie, but also manifested in the site itself and in the discussions between the archaeologists and the community members at this school. So the article is called Discourses of the Haunted, and an intersubjective approach to archaeology at the Mount Pleasant Indian Industrial Boarding School. So starting with the article, Indigenous scholarship is using hauntings as part of decolonizing practice. That it is a way of knowing, is to think about and look at what ghosts are lingering and what places are haunted. The Mount Pleasant Indian Industrial Boarding School is an interesting place in itself because the Indigenous community has taken ownership of the building and cemetery part of the property, not the entire property. So just lingering a bit on the title of the school, the Mount Pleasant Indian Industrial Boarding School. And why is industrial in the title? Because what was being taught here was a form of capitalism, that Indigenous cultures were not valued because they did things like share resources and not invest every moment of every day into trying to gain wealth. So the industry was being taught there, and mostly being taught to boys, whereas girls were taught to be domestic servants in a way, to take care of households, to sew and mend, and to be devalued at the same time, because the women's work was not something that was going to produce capital. So therefore, women were to be devalued, which is against a lot of Indigenous cultures in North America, where Indigenous women are the center of being honored in the culture. And we'll get back to that a couple of times. So on page 110 of the article, the Sarahs say that they're investigating the complex history of federal Indian boarding schools, and this requires the perspective created by feminist intersubjectivity and intersectionality. Because if you don't take a feminist lens, you don't see all of what's going on there, because it was basically a school to teach patriarchy. So the goals of their work here is, one, to decolonize their own archaeological practice and inspire others to do the same by empowering a collaborative community to do this work. So one of the things that they do here is that the archaeologist isn't the expert, and everybody else is there along for the ride and grateful to be part of what an archaeologist is doing. The archaeologist is there as part of a community where people who have oral histories to tell are also experts. People who know the written history of the school are also experts, and so forth. So therefore, the archaeological practice is more decentralized and more communal. Goal number 2 is to elicit untold and hidden narratives, and that's where the haunting aspect comes in. That when you excavate out of the ground, or you find something on the architecture of the building, or you go to the cemetery, you point to the materiality and you ask what stories these things have, what meanings these have to living people. And then they tell stories that are often of the haunting nature. And goal number 3 was to forefront the racial, the gendered, and the colonial histories of this place. On page 111, they say that they want to challenge the settler colonial narrative surrounding federal Indian boarding schools and create discourses that capture the many experiences of students and descendants. This is because the things that people do know about Indian boarding schools are usually about the top-down powers, the controllers, sometimes being religious organizations, sometimes being the government itself, is abusing, beating, doing everything to take the culture away from these children, that these are children that they've already forcibly taken away from their families and their homelands. So you go to reservations all around, you take the kids, you bring them to these schools, you force them to cut their hair, to give up their clothing, to abandon their language, you teach them English, you make them behave like Americans or Canadians forcibly, right? So that is the narrative that the people who do know about boarding schools know, which is important to know. But the narrative that most people don't know is that many of the indigenous children resisted. And what they could do to resist included everything from running away to dying. There are cemeteries at these schools where most schools shouldn't have a cemetery. Almost every Indian boarding school has a cemetery, and that should right there haunt you and make you see how wrong it is that not only they took their children away, but they never even returned them in death, right? So resistance sometimes included dying, sometimes included running away, but other times included the altering of the building and the archaeological record that is left there itself, the things that we see. So there was a Indian boarding school in Phoenix, Arizona, that another archaeologist did work on many years ago, and the kinds of things that he found there was that the indigenous students would practice making stone tools, arrowheads, on broken shards of glass. So these pieces of glass that they found in the trash had this. That's just one of the many examples of the resistance that you could see there. So by doing this archaeology and by telling these ghost stories, they want to unsettle the narrative that, oh, it's just so sad what happened there, to, yeah, it's sad and upsetting what happened there, but it wasn't a passive thing. There was resistance. There was this agency that these children had, and one of the sad things is that we don't recognize that agency. On page 111, they say, we use the perspective of haunting as a way to conceptualize traumatic histories of structural oppression and activate community healing through engagement. Perhaps one of the greatest strengths of community-based archaeology is its potential for drawing out ghosts, acknowledging their presence, and giving them a voice. This is the Archaeology as exorcism that Harrison and Schofield talk about in their book After Modernity that we keep coming back to. So the group here, the indigenous group that owns part of this property now, is the Saginaw Chippewa Indian tribe of Michigan. So they say that the members of the Saginaw Chippewa Indian tribe of Michigan and faculty and students from Central Michigan University work collaboratively to research various aspects of the school's history. Our work incorporates archival research, oral histories, and archaeological data. By community direction, much of this work focuses on the intersectional relationships between race and gender within the institution. So that's what the Saginaw Chippewa want to talk about when it comes to this school. In particular, at these co-educational schools, diverse indigenous gender traditions and gender roles were attempted to be eliminated through systematic institutional violence to enforce Western ideologies of gender binaries and separate spheres ideology. So the Mount Pleasant School operated for 41 years, closing in 1934, and that produced, in 41 years, a cemetery the size of 2 acres. On page 111, they say that the school is the source of many stories and much speculation, which is perhaps an excellent indicator of its status as haunted. We use haunting not in a literal sense, but as a social framework for understanding the impact of the past on the present. The after effects of the federal Indian boarding school policies are disproportionately felt by Native American communities, while at the same time ignored, denied, and forgotten by national historic narratives. So the movie that we'll talk about after takes a more literal turn on the haunting, where here the haunting is that you can't forget, that it sticks with you, that it lingers, instead of that there's actually a physically manifested ghost. On page 112, they say, while ghosts are disembodied, they are not necessarily intangible. Haunting is attached to material traces of places and items that have been touched by trauma. So they go on in the article to talk about bricks, a lot of bricks, that people generally won't value a brick from a historic site as containing essentially the ghosts of the past. But at this school, the bricks contain them in multiple ways. But also a toothbrush that somebody else might interpret as a hygiene item to brush your teeth at night. The community members interpreted it as one of the tools that young girls were forced to clean with, and how it would take forever to clean a bathroom with a toothbrush, that it was part of the violence inflicted on them. So before we get there, let's get to manifesting one of our ghosts. They say on page 112 that the historian Tia Miles posits that female ghostly figures in particular are used to expose past racialized and gender-based violence from a safe emotional distance, whereas male ghosts tend to be much more aggressive and things to be afraid of, or that they embody anger. Female ghosts tend to embody something that is a loss of a kind that you regret is lost instead of that you're afraid of. So they tell our first story here, the story of a Lakota child named Take the Tail, who was known also to non-Indians as Lucy Pretty Eagle. So this kind of Americanization of Native names. Instead of Take the Tail, which isn't something that America would kind of idealize as such a beautiful name, they changed her name to Lucy Pretty Eagle. So Take the Tail was one of the first victims of Richard Henry Pratt's experiment at the Carlisle Indian School, which is in Pennsylvania. Dying mere months after arriving to the harsh and unfamiliar institution. Nearly 100 years after her death, Take the Tail was reincarnated as a ghost who haunted the former school grounds, her life and death reimagined by the family of Army officers living at Carlisle because it became an Army training school. In particular, her death was embellished as an Indian girl buried alive, a gruesome metaphor for colonization and the spiritual, cultural, and psychic suffocation and trauma Indian children suffered at Carlisle and other boarding schools. So switching back to Michigan, on page 113 they say, in the case of Mount Pleasant School, haunting seems to be an integral part of the Saginaw Chippewas' coping with colonial trauma that similarly exists at the intersections of race, class, and gender. So they use the concept of traumascape that comes from the book Blurring Timescapes that we covered in 3 weeks. And Sarah Surface Evans is one of the editors of that book. And in that book, she talked about the Scott Park and the power station in Lansing, Michigan. So here, still Sarah Surface Evans, still Michigan, but a different traumascape. So she says that traumascapes can become the focus of a search for meaning and understanding for survivors who are confronted by the memories of past events. Based on this definition, federal Indian boarding schools and other sites of violent colonialism and structural oppression are clearly traumascapes. The hauntings at Mount Pleasant begins with that they destroyed, the federal government destroyed burial mounds, grave sites of the same indigenous people who live there today to build this school that housed people from various areas. And while the school was in operation, there's an oral history that the students told stories of the hauntings that included the haunted attics of the dorms and haunted woodlots. According to oral history, the woodlot is haunted by the ghosts of students who died at the school and whose bodies were buried secretly in the woods at night. So they're going to focus on not only these general tellings of the stories, but how those general tellings can be integrated with archaeology. And one of the things that you do in archaeology is you go to the place, you go to the site, you do the site tour. And they say that as one tribal elder stated after touring the boarding school buildings, you could feel our pain in these walls. So excavation with the community revealed some artifacts, and those artifacts also enabled the telling of ghost stories. On page 114, they say that the artifacts served as mnemonic devices that activated memory and exorcised negative ghosts, similar to the way in which the Anishinaabe communities use medicines like sage, tobacco, and cedar to remove bad energy and encourage good energy. On page 114 still, they say, often the focus of ghostly narratives among the Saginaw Chippewa community is on transforming the negative into the positive. Sarah Jones, one of the authors of this article, explains that negative talk of the deceased detracts from their journey in the afterlife. Therefore, there is a strong desire to promote positive energy over the negative when dealing with the specters of the past. So the ghost stories that the Saginaw Chippewa speak of from Mount Pleasant Indian Boarding School is generally spoken of in a positive way, not in a we're afraid of these people, not in a we can't go there because it's haunted, but in a way of talking positively about them to remember them, and in that way the good energy dispels the bad energy. So, still on page 114, the goal here is to move beyond stories of suffering so that community members find and reclaim their own stories of empowerment. To demonstrate this approach, we share here 3 stories of hauntings as told through 3 objects: a bead, bricks, and a toothbrush. Each object is linked to institutional patterns of control and oppression, while simultaneously revealing individual stories of subversion, resistance, and rebellion. In each story, the narrative that unfolds was brought to light because of the ways in which Saginaw Chippewa community members were haunted by these objects. So this is very similar to the indigenous horror film Older Than America, where the indigenous writing, producing, directing, and acting in this movie is a way of reclaiming the narrative, but also the hauntings, that these are their ghosts, and that their ghosts need to be spoken of in a way that does justice, but in a positive way. So, sticking with the Mount Pleasant School, they talk about how indigenous girls were trained to be homemakers. And if they tried to do their traditional roles, they were abused, beaten, punished some way. So one of the things they weren't allowed to do was their traditional beadwork, the making of objects through beads, the making of decorations. I have, from the same community, I have a beaded keychain. So continuing of traditional beadwork at the school, even though it was not allowed, is an act of resistance that is documented by the finding of beads at the school. And when community members saw the beads found at the schools, one of them told a story about her own mother who went to the school and used beadwork even after she left the school as a way of maintaining culture in the face of assimilation, and taught beadwork to others outside of the school in this continuity sort of way. So on page 115, the small bead found at the Domestic Science Building at the Mount Pleasant School is a symbol of perseverance, resistance, and female empowerment in the face of the institution's goals of forced subservience. So it's not finding gold at the archaeological site. It's not finding jewels, something valuable in a capitalistic sense. It's finding a bead that shouldn't be there. Just like at the Phoenix School, finding an arrowhead made on a piece of glass. Sometimes these very small things are linked to these very big ideas of agency, of sentimentality, of trying to keep something alive or keep doing something when the forces around you don't want you to do it. So they also talk about how the girls were not allowed to learn the industrial parts of the industry school, and especially this shop building where you learned things like wood carving and repair. But the outside of this building, this brick building, has the initials of students etched on it, and only 55% of those are clearly men. So in some ways that could be interpreted as the girls claiming ownership of a building or association with a building that the school itself was trying to say was not a place for schools. So on page 116, they say the most empowering narrative of rebellion told in the Saginaw Chippewa community centers around the drastic and brave measures taken by a 14-year-old Potawatomi girl named Martha Shaughnessy. She, at 14 years old, and a student at the school, exposed the fragility of the institution. In the pre-dawn hours of June 14, 1899, Martha set fire to her dormitory at the Mount Pleasant Industrial School in an attempt to free herself from the institution that had taken her from her family and her community. The entire building, which also housed the school's offices and most of the classrooms at the time, was consumed by the blaze. Martha's fire was the most catastrophic act of rebellion in the history of Mount Pleasant Boarding School. Her remarkable story shows the determination of a young woman who was desperate to escape the institution, but she chose to do it in the most destructive manner possible rather than simply running away. So Martha is a ghost of the school, even though she didn't die there, right? Her legacy is that she created destruction in the face of a power that seemingly was more powerful than her, but she destroyed it, at least for a short period of time. Archaeological survey in the vicinity of the girls' dormitory recovered primary burnt brick, melted glass, and other construction debris surrounding the foundation of the new dormitory building. It appears that the institution covered up the event and moved on, right? But those burned bricks, that melted glass, it's not just trash. It's evidence of Martha's agency, that a 14-year-old girl can cause something to at least stop for a while. And even though they rebuilt the building, they can't get rid of the evidence of what Martha did. In that way, it's both haunting and has an amazing story to tell. So, how do hauntings change archaeology? On page 117, they say that rather than relying on traditional methods of archaeological interpretation, which seek to make sterile scientific interpretations of evidence, we, the two Sarahs in this paper, centered these narratives around personal connections relevant to the community. So they used the telling of stories of ghosts and hauntings and the ideas of lingering to come out with these different stories about Indian boarding schools that are evidenced by tiny, tiny artifacts like a toothbrush, a bead, brick, and melted glass.